Fantasy points allowed is really just a small pawn in what is wide receivers versus the best and worst cornerbacks in the entire NFL and defensive schemes. Don't fall victim to starting the wrong guys because of ignorance and you're not aware. Today we cover the absolute best and worst wide receiver to cornerback matchups coming into week 15 to take advantage of or be completely avoiding to make it to the next round of the fantasy football playoffs and make all the right start-sit decisions. Everything will be covered in this video. Starting, the singular most important factor here that everyone needs to know is success rate versus coverage. Marvin Harrison Jr. is going to be the first wide receiver here we need to be taking advantage of 100%, but more specifically, Christian Gonzalez and Jonathan Jones. And the reason I bring them both up here is because Marv lines up on the left 60% of his routes. Jonathan Jones and Gonzalez split the field up 40-40 as far as right to left. So unless Gonzalez is shadowing Marv the entire game, which I don't think is really going to happen, he's in for a good one. Marv is leading the Cardinals, believe it or not, in targets per route run at 23% and has one of the best separation rates, helping him total 20 targets in that 2-week stretch and having a 81.9% route participation rate. That is leading the Cardinals as a whole. It is a positive matchup all the way around though, outside of Gonzalez, who we will probably be playing against most likely, but Jones as well. They're allowing 23.6 points per game to opposing offenses on the year. That is top 10. They are also bottom 10 in turnovers forced and pressure rate per game, which suggests Kyler Murray will likely be able to have time for his routes to develop downfield, which is very good for Marvin Harrison, who runs a ton of deep routes. That's been his biggest issue all year. He's had to scramble out of the pocket way too soon. There are only 3 teams ahead of the Cardinals in projected point scoring this week, with the Ravens, Lions, and the Bills. The Cardinals are 4th next up at 26 points as a collective team. Gonzalez himself is allowing 17.5% target share per route run on the year and also allowing a 0.23 fantasy point per reception number that's about average in the NFL. But since Marvin Harrison Jr. is going to get Jonathan Jones half the game, this man allows 0.37 fantasy points per route run. That's amazing. That's like the number one best cornerback matchup of the entire week. So as long as we get him on Marvin Harrison instead of Michael Wilson for most of the time, it will be absolutely amazing. Because of that, Michael Wilson can be a dart throw at a flex spot if you're in a deeper league. I wouldn't suggest it, but the matchup says that Michael Wilson has a very, very positive one. He could be in a good spot to shine if you're in a deeper league. But the next extremely positive wide receiver to cornerback matchup here is going to be Calvin Ridley against Josh Newton and the Bengals. It quite literally does not matter. This Bengals defense is and has been one of the worst in the NFL, regardless of what corner he gets. Whether it's him, Cam Taylor-Britt, both of them are top 5 in most fantasy points allowed to opposing wide receivers, and they are both allowing over 0.35 fantasy points to wide receivers per route run. This defense as a whole is just absolutely terrible. They are allowing the 3rd most points to opposing offenses at 27.7 on the year. If you isolate their last 6 games, that's what? 32.8 points a game to opposing offenses. And then you look at Calvin Ridley himself. He has stepped up extremely when all things are considered after DeAndre Hopkins left the team, averaging over 0.4 fantasy points per reception in that stretch himself and 8.8 targets per game, 26.3 targets per route run. Again, these are all really good numbers, and to make all of this even better, he does have one of the easiest fantasy playoff schedules if you continue to advance into the playoffs. He leads this team in route participation. Hopefully, Will Levis can actually put it together. Unfortunately, Will Levis is one of the worst starting quarterbacks in the NFL, but despite all of that, Calvin Ridley is still averaging 0.4 fantasy points per route run. That's a good number. Added to the matchup, he has a high scoring potential. It's a 49-point game total with both of these teams, and the Titans are 5-point underdogs, suggesting they're going to pass a lot, and the Bengals offense is amazing. You're going to have to keep up with it somehow. It should be a great spot for Calvin Ridley. But one of my absolute favorite wide receivers with a top 3 cornerback matchup this week coming into week 15 is Jakobi Meyers getting the Falcons, and whatever corner they decide to throw at him. The Falcons as a whole have been one of the worst at defending the pass this year. They allow the 2nd most points to opposing wide receivers and are a complete pass funnel of a defense. It's defenses like these you have to pass because of how good the matchup is. Mike Hughes, the corner that is primarily going to be matched up against Jakobi Meyers, he just came back last week in his first game off injury. He only played 27% of the snaps. I expect that to be more towards 70 or 80. He will likely take that number 1 corner job over Clark Phillips now that he's coming into this matchup healthy. We do have AJ Terrell on the other side of the ball, who is a little bit better as far as defense goes, but still, it's a super positive matchup. He himself, AJ Terrell, had 0 tackles, no sacks, didn't record a single stat last week against the Vikings, despite them putting up 42 total points as a team, despite also him playing 100% of the snaps on the field the whole time. The Falcons allow a 76% catchable target rate on passes over 10 yards down the field. There are only 3 teams with over 70%, and they are one of them, number 1, by a good amount. They are by far the easiest team to throw on, and when you look at Myers, he has been seeing a ton of of success as of late, 12 targets a game over his last 3 games. This is another guy that leads his team in route participation and lines up all over the field, 30% on the right, 36% to the left, 34% in the slot, has a 22.9% target per route run rate. Again, these are all great numbers. O'Connell is at risk of missing this game, which might lower Myers' upside just a little bit, but again, this game is being played on Monday. It's kind of a mini bye. He's hopeful to play. He might get in there. If he does, it's definitely going to be a spot where we want to be starting Jakobi Meyers. They're top 5 in passing attempts per game, regardless of who this quarterback ends up being. But we do need to be exploiting the matchup of Jalen Waddle against a very, very struggling Houston Texans secondary. I'll include Tyreek in here too, but obviously he's going to be a locked and loaded start every week. He benefits from this positive matchup, but we'll be talking about Jalen Waddle in this part of the video. To be more specific, it's the slot wide receiver in Jalen Waddle versus the Texans secondary, who are top 3 in fantasy points allowed, yards allowed, and general success rate allowed to wide receivers this year. Out of the slot specifically, they are top 5 in every single wide receiver statistic allowed. Slot wide receivers they are extremely bad against. Waddle, again, is his team's primary slot guy. Ever since Tyreek did come to this offense, Waddle has been getting a little bit lower of those slot snaps, but it's about even now. It's still good for him. The entire secondary, again, like I talked about for Houston, is an extreme liability. Lassiter and Stingley, they have not been performing as well as of late as they were in the beginning of the season. This defensive scheme is just allowing a lot of fantasy points to wide receivers, and most importantly, Waddle himself has kind of come back to life over the last few weeks. 20 fantasy points in 2 out of his last 3 games, 8.3 targets a game, and 98.6 receiving yards in that 3-game stretch. And another very important factor here outside of the matchup and the recent success of Jalen Waddle himself, Tua's pass volume is absolutely great and suggests a lot of upside. He's averaging 42.25 passing attempts per game over his last 4 and 37.6 since returning from his injury in week 8. That gives these wide receivers a ton of upside as far as receptions and also routes run per game, which we'd like to see, and touchdowns because we know this offense. Now, we should be a little bit cautious. Waddle is dealing with a hamstring injury. He's limited coming into practices. He hasn't had a full practice yet. Keep an eye on that. If he is 100%, this is a spot where we start him and don't think twice. The Texans are favored by 3 points coming into this matchup in a very high scoring projected game, one of the highest of the week. So all positive green light there. We do, on the other side of this video, need to be going through sitting and avoiding the matchups of Michael Pittman and Patrick Surtain with the Broncos. If you've been around these videos for long enough this year, you know how much I talk about Patrick Surtain being an absolute nightmare for fantasy football and wide receiver points allowed to opposing guys. Surtain allows 0.13 fantasy points per route run this year and only 9.3 targets per route run on that as well. He's one of the best corners in coverage regardless of where you put him on the field, and it's not like it's a great Colts offense. We have to worry about a good amount of upside coming, and he has to play really good. Anthony Richardson is bottom 5 in passing attempts on the year and has one of the lowest passing touchdown rates out of any quarterback. He is great in the run game, but again, the Broncos are good at that too. They are one of the best pressure rate defenses in the NFL. They have 47 sacks on the year. It's a very tough spot for Pittman and this offense in general to succeed. The Colts have run what's deemed as a successful play on 40.7% of their passing attempts against a base rush this year. That's 5th worst in the entire NFL. While you look at the Broncos, they've allowed successful plays on 41.6% of opposing pass attempts by offenses against their base rush defense. That is 5th best in the entire NFL. You can see where those two things match. So when you look at Pittman specifically, he doesn't have much of a ceiling. His best game came in week 4 against the Pittsburgh Steelers. He only had 6 receptions for 113 yards. That's good for 17.3 fantasy points. That was only one of his 4 games where he put up double-digit fantasy points this year. A big reason for that is because of the opportunities that he in this offense has. Again, Richardson is only averaging 24 passing attempts a game. On that, 58% of those passing attempts have been 10 yards or less down the field. The league average is 70%. So you look at that and think, okay, he's throwing downfield. That's probably a good thing, right? That brings some upside. Well, that's not really good for Michael Pittman. It's good for everybody else. Michael Pittman is a slot wide receiver. He barely runs any routes over 15 yards. His upside to go over 10 or even 15 fantasy points is extremely low because of those factors. He's gone under his reception line in his last 11 out of 15 games. That's including last year as well. He just is not that dynamic of a wide receiver. Coming off his back injury, he looks to be fully healthy. We'll see what happens this week. I don't want to risk it in our first week of the fantasy football playoffs to advance us another one. But another situation here we need to avoid is Demario Douglas against Garrett Williams and the Cardinals. The defense, one that has been written off and everybody is not really respecting. They are a little bit better, slightly better than what people and the narrative suggests. We talked about Patrick Surtain only allowing 0.13 fantasy points per route run. Williams is at 0.17, so he is also a very good corner in that aspect. He allows a 12.7% target per route run percentage, which is one of the better ones and I guess lower ones in the NFL. And Demario Douglas isn't necessarily an X wide receiver. He's averaging 0.3 fantasy points per reception. That's not terrible. That's about average in the NFL, but he's averaging 5.4 targets per game and a 17.1% target percentage. That is just extremely low in the NFL, especially coming from a slot wide receiver. Despite averaging 5.5 receptions a game, he's only at 32.8 receiving yards because of how bad this Patriots offense is. And again, the fact that he runs from the slot, you just don't typically get those downfield plays. His highest yards per target this year has been 10.2 against the Houston defense. Again, another reason we need to be smash starting Jalen Waddle. We can bank on the fact that he doesn't really have spike weeks either. Only 5 of his 13 games have been over 10 fantasy points, 1 touchdown on the year as well. That doesn't suggest a lot of upside. The Patriots are averaging 3.8 points per red zone drive this season. That's 4th worst in the NFL. But the Cardinals, on the other hand, are allowing 3.9 points per red zone drive. That's 4th best in the NFL. Again, another reason this Cardinals defense is a little better than the narrative suggests. There's no offensive consistency here for the Patriots, though. May is averaging a good amount of passing attempts, but their completions don't add up to what that should be as far as the pass level. There's no wide receivers here that really elevates this offense to keep them moving. A lot of the volume does go to the tight ends. Douglas is a safe floor kind of guy, but really has no ceiling, and that's what we want to be hunting for in these fantasy football playoffs. If you guys are looking for more nuclear start and sits as far as more positions of running backs, quarterbacks, all that goes, make sure to be subscribed and stick around for tomorrow's video on Saturday. I will go over my official list of starts and sits for this week. You guys don't want to miss that. Thank you so much for sticking through this one. All glory to the man above.